Okay, Warwick, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the February talk with AHSA Queensland. And Peter will introduce our speaker shortly. Just to mention that next month, our March meeting, we'll be having Noel Dennett flying a Boeing 747 from Bangkok to London, talking about all that's involved from a piloting point of view. I'm sure that'll be very good. Just briefly about other things, we'll be having another couple of Zoom meetings before we'll have some physical meeting at AHSA Field, and having a inspection of aircraft at the Fighters Museum at AHSA Field, where there is a Spitfire P-51D Mustang, American one, L-39, and some other aircraft, including Waco normally. Some of the aircraft might change as time goes on between now and then. Then we'll expect to revert to AHSA Field meetings about the middle of the year. More details will follow, of course, and I'll throw back to you now, Peter, if you'd like to introduce our other speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's guest speaker is Rochelle Nichols, who you can see on the screen. Rochelle's writing career began at the age of 5 when she was elevated upper class at school, where her teachers realised that she could already write full sentences, which also included correct punctuation. Rochelle holds a PhD in science and has worked as a medical researcher in Australia, the USA and Europe. Rochelle's books all profile Australian men who battle to the top the hard way, including the rags to riches story of Australia's first pro baseball player, Joe Quinn, Olympic swimmer Cecil Healy, who gave away a gold medal in the interest of fair play, and young pilot Jim Kitchenside, who went to war after just 8 hours of training on Australia's new jets and became known as the Korean Kid. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker, Rochelle Nichols. Over to you, Rochelle.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I really do feel very privileged tonight to be joining you to give this talk, and I have to confess to feeling a few nerves now, knowing that there are some members of 77 Squadron in the audience who were familiar with Jim during their flying days. So for those of you that have just joined the meeting, as I mentioned to some of the participants earlier, and as you would have heard in the introduction, my background is in medical research and later on in newspaper journalism. So you might have to bear with me, given the fact that I'm no aircraft expert. I'm just the person who had the honour and the privilege of putting Jim Kitchenside's story into words. I had the privilege of meeting Jim Kitchenside about 10 years ago while I was working as a newspaper reporter. My editor tasked me with getting a story on the Korean War because at the time, Julia Gillard was the Prime Minister, and in 2011, she spent Anzac Day in Korea. And that move seemed to prompt many Australians to ask the question, what is she doing in Korea? What's in Korea? And it really seemed to raise an awareness, I think, amongst the media at least, that between the Second World War and Vietnam, another international conflict had occurred in which Australian service personnel were, highly active, but not many Australians really seemed to realise the contribution that Australia had made in the Korean War. And so it was as part of that effort that I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Jim. And as you can see, I've since had the further honour of taking the story that I wrote 10 years ago about him and turning it into the book that we're going to discuss tonight. So I guess just as a little footnote to that, as you can probably tell, I'm no aircraft expert, and so please don't bombard me with technical questions because I probably won't be able to answer them. But I'll certainly would love to share Jim's story, his life story with you tonight. So I'm just going to share my screen, if you just bear with me. What I'd like to do at the start of this talk is just for you all to engage your imaginations and come with me back to the year of 1942. So you're a 12-year-old boy from the industrial heartland of Sydney, and you're standing with a group of other boys, all in hand-me-down clothes, and you're peering through a chain link fence, because on the other side of that fence are aircraft. They're aircraft painted in the grey and green of war, with the thrilling insignia of the Royal Australian Air Force painted on their flanks. There are aircraft taxiing, looping, circuiting, and every time one roars over your heads, you all wave madly and tear off your caps and jump up and down and cheer. Your heart feels like it'll burst with longing. The other boys in the group are all trying to outdo each other with ludicrous tales of what they'd do if they had a plane. One wag suggests that he'd fly it to school every day. Another that he'd fly his all the way to England to meet the king. But you say nothing. Your family have dragged themselves through the Great Depression, and now there is the war. And this is industrial Marrickville, where boys grow up to be grocers and plumbers and postmen. You know there will be no money for flying lessons for you. But the dream of flying refuses to leave you. For 12-year-old Jim Kishenside doesn't just want to fly, to defy gravity and soar among the clouds. He's seen the way that men and women look at the pilots in their blue RAAF uniforms in the streets of Sydney. He's seen the way that people look at them with respect and with awe. He knows pilots are the best of the best, the elite. They're special. And Jim Kishenside wants to be looked at like that. But more than anything, for Jim Kishenside, flying means escape. Escape from the overcrowded house, escape from the arguments about money, escape from having to sleep on the back porch while rain drips through the roof onto his camp bed. Some days, all Jim Kishenside wants is to fly away. So tonight, I'd like to share a little of the story about a boy from a working class family hit hard by the Depression, who rose to join the ranks of Australia's elite fighter pilots, who endured a baptism of fire in the skies above Korea as one of Australia's youngest pilots, who went on to become amongst the first jet instructors and one of the first Australians to log 1,000 hours on jets, who led both the RAAF's most ambitious mission in Antarctica and went on to fly in the tropical jungles of Malaya, Thailand, and New Guinea in the deadly lead up to the Vietnam War. Jim Kishenside was part of the generation that led Australian defence into the jet age. So Jim Kishenside was a child of two of the greatest cataclysms in 20th century Australian history, the Great Depression and World War II. He was born at the height of the Depression in 1930 in Marrickville, in the working class heart of Sydney. And the economic crash meant that Jim, his parents, and 3 sisters all had to move in with his grandmother in a tiny 2-bedroom house. There was nowhere for Jim to sleep except on the back veranda. Anyone wanting to go to the outhouse or the back garden had to walk through this makeshift bedroom, meaning there was very little privacy or protection from the elements. Packed into such a small house, overcrowding and financial pressure made the family atmosphere volatile, and Jim couldn't help hearing his parents arguing through the thin walls of the cottage. But from the Kishenside cottage in Roseby Street, it was just a short walk up along the Cooks River to the aerodrome at Mascot, and this was one of the favourite hangouts of the local Marrickville lads, who pressed their noses against the fence and hoped for a glimpse of some of the greats of Australian aviation. Ross and Keith Smith had landed their Vickers Vimy at the aerodrome in 1920 to celebrate winning the great air race from London to Darwin. Charles Kingsford Smith, after whom the airfield was rechristened in 1936, had taken off from Mascot with Charles Ulm in 1927 to circumnavigate Australia in a Bristol tourer and returned in triumph 10 days later. Nancy Bird enrolled at Kingsford Smith's flying school at Mascot in 1932 at the age of just 17, and 2 years later, she became the youngest Australian woman to hold a pilot's licence. And with the coming of the Second World War, suddenly the Mascot airfield was home to military aircraft too, to communications units and young pilots earning their stripes in de Havilland Moths. But Jim Kishenside was too young to sign up during the war, and to earn a domestic pilot's license at the time would cost £200, more than his father earned working at the General Post Office in a whole year. When Jim left school in 1947, it was to enter an accountancy traineeship, and it almost crushed his spirit with the tedious and menial work. But hate it as he did, it was this job that would change his life 2 years later. One of Jim's daily tasks was to compile a report on stock market trends out of the national newspapers. But on page 8 of the Sydney Morning Herald of April the 26th, 1949, Jim Kishenside saw this. The RAAF were calling for trainee pilots. The very next day, Jim Kishenside quit his trusty, reliable job to sign up. And then he figured he ought to tell his parents what he'd done. His father, who was a lifelong employee of the Postal Service, was outraged. He accused his son of throwing away lifetime security for the glamour of a blue uniform. And admittedly, the odds were ridiculous. Of the 1,200 applicants for the No. 4 training course, at the end, only 10 would be fighter pilots. But Jim Kishenside defied his father to sign up, and by August of 1949, he was en route for Point Cook RAF Base in Victoria. The Australian Air Force had been dramatically downsized after World War II, from 182,000 personnel to just 8,000. But with the Menzies Liberal victory in the federal election of 1949, defence spending increased over 50%, and in that year, 150 pilot hopefuls made the first cut, with Jim Kishenside one of the youngest at barely 19 years old. And the standard at Point Cook were exacting. After just 10 hours in the de Havilland DH-82 Tiger Moth, any recruits not flying solo were cut. Well, despite never having been closer to an aircraft than the fence at Mascot, Kishenside was flying solo in 8 hours. So the survivors of the cut spent 150 hours in Wirraways, a grumpy, noisy old piston engine fighter that had seen service in New Guinea during the war, with its frightening tendency to drop a wing on landing. But as the boys of No. 4 course, now down to 75 in number, approached the end of their first year at Point Cook in the middle of 1950, the meaning of being a fighter pilot was about to change. June the 25th, 1950, the world, so weary of war, was back at war. The Korean Peninsula had been occupied by Japan since 1910, and with the Japanese downfall at the end of World War II, Allied forces had divided the liberated peninsula in two along the 38th parallel. The peninsula was now to be overseen by a trusteeship between the United States, who administered the southern half, and the Soviet Union, the north. However, their plans for eventual reunification were stymied by opposition from the communist north, and, backed by Joseph Stalin, North Korean forces led by the rebel fighter Kim Il-sung invaded the southern half of the peninsula in a lightning attack in June 1950. Within 3 days, the southern capital of Seoul was in flames, and President Syngman-rhee's Southern Army and citizens were in retreat before a monstrous onslaught. The Korean War was it had many firsts, but one of the primary ones was that it was the first war of a new nuclear age. And knowing this, the world was quick to respond, rushing international forces from more than 24 countries to assist the South, with the legendary American General Douglas MacArthur at the forefront. The RAAF's number 77 Fighter Squadron was still based in Japan on occupation duties, and now were amongst the first in the air, given their orders to fly just 4 days after the invasion. Their P-51 Mustangs, backed by the US 5th Air Force, were initially effective against the old North Korean Yakovlev 9 fighters. 77 Squadron was soon flying up to 300 sorties a day, mainly on dead reckoning, out of their base in Japan. But in November 1950, the Communist forces of the North introduced a new and deadly opponent for the UN Air Forces, the superlight MiG-15 jet, with its Rolls-Royce centrifugal compressor jet engine driving it to speeds approaching 1,000 kilometers an hour and traveling in packs of up to 150 aircraft. The war had suddenly become a high-stakes, high-tech aerial arms race. And with the introduction of the MiG came the casualties. While the US Air Force swiftly countered the introduction of the MiG with its own F-86 Sabre jet, which could actually outfly the MiG below 30,000 feet, the US could not manufacture enough Sabres to equip 77 Squadron as well. And the suddenly underpowered Australians began to take serious casualties. By the end of 1951, 1 in 4 pilots from 77 Squadron had been captured or killed over Korea, and 77 Squadron were reassigned from an aerial combat role to ground attack. The result of these significant casualties was that young pilots now had to be rushed to the front. In April of 1951, just under a year after the commencement of the war, 77 Squadron acquired the first batch of UK-built Gloucester Meteor F-8 jets in an attempt to counteract the air power of the MiG. The RAAF pilots were actually withdrawn from combat for 3 months of conversion training on the Meteor in Japan. But by the time Jim Kishenside and his cohorts from number 4 course were called up to Korea in early 1952, conversion training had been cut from 3 months down to 8 hours. That's right, 8 hours, less than 1 working day, or around 5 test flights to master the handling, formation flying, tactics, and gunnery in an aircraft they had never seen before landing in Japan, before these young pilots were sent to the front. They did have some jet experience before leaving Australia, which consisted of around 30 hours in the first generation de Havilland FB-31 Vampire, which is shown here in this image, ironically, alongside a MiG. But the difference in performance between the Vampire and the Meteor was significant. So when Jim Kishenside arrived in Korea in March of 1952, 77 Squadron had been moved from Japan to a base at Kimpo, north of Seoul, just 50 kilometers from the border with North Korea. Kimpo was a crowded United Nations airfield with one of the highest rates of air traffic in the world. And there was no time for Kishenside to settle in. He was in the air in a Meteor the day of his arrival for his first reconnaissance mission. It was just 7 days later that he had to pull the trigger for the first time on a mission to Chinampo, a delta city on the west coast of North Korea, as Chinese troops were being flushed out of a nearby village. All that rocketry practice, all the gunnery fire in training against wooden targets and old trucks can never prepare a 21-year-old pilot for having to shoot at a live human being for the first time. The image would remain burned upon his retinas for the rest of his life. 3 days later, Jim Kishenside's tent mate, Lionel Cowper, was shot down over Haeju and never seen again. The war had come to meet Jim Kishenside. But somehow, this 21-year-old pilot survived his first 50 missions, which he flew in just 6 weeks. Jim said later that survival seemed more a matter of luck than management. For example, On a further mission to Chinampo in April of 1952, on the tarmac, Jim Kishenside's jet wouldn't start, so his place in the lineup was taken by a reserve pilot, and that pilot was shot down and killed. But for pilots who did reach that 50 mission milestone, special recognition came. Instead of just flying whichever aircraft was serviceable or available, these pilots then became custodians of their own jet. And in Kishenside's case, the US Air Force ground crews got together to paint a unique logo on the nose of his jet to commemorate his status as the youngest pilot in 77 Squadron. Jim Kishenside had become the Korean Kid. However, the difficulties that the RAAF were operating under in Korea, with high casualty rates, a still underpowered aircraft, overworked pilots, and a shortage of replacements, was going largely unremarked in Australia, although not for want of trying. On the 15th of May 1952, Don Robertson, who'd been the Ducks of No. 1 course, was killed just 6 weeks after arriving in Korea, and he was just 22 years old. Robertson's devastated father began an impassioned letter-writing campaign back in Australia, calling on the media to expose the tragedy in Korea and for politicians to stop it. But little was done, except that Kishenside and 3 of his colleagues, who'd all accumulated almost 100 missions in their first 8 weeks at the front, were hastily sent for recreational leave in Japan for 10 days, which was double the usual allowance. However, just days after they returned, in July of 1952, Ken Smith, who was the Ducks of No. 5 course, was shot down and killed. Ken Smith was another tent mate of Jim Kishenside and had been the best man at Kishenside's wedding just days before the two were sent to Korea. The cruelties of the war were not finished with Jim Kishenside yet. On August the 27th, he was part of a 16-man mission to rocket a barracks north of the border. But when he reached the tarmac at Kimpo, he found fellow pilot Olaf Berg already strapped into the Korean Kid aircraft. But he was anxious not to be left behind, so Kishenside dived into a reserve plane and took his place in the lineup. But as they dived on the target, Berg was hit. The Korean Kid exploded as it hit the side of a hill. Berg managed to parachute clear, and when he did hit the ground in North Korean territory, miraculously, he managed to elude his North Korean captors for an incredible 7 days before collapsing finally from hunger and exhaustion. Olaf Berg was held as a prisoner of war, enduring torture and interrogation while spending much of his year-long incarceration immersed up to his neck in a pit of freezing water. If Jim Kishenside had been in his own plane that day, this may well have been his own fate. On the 10th of September 1952, for Jim Kishenside, it was finally over. 77 Squadron CO came to the showers and told Kishenside and his mate Max Uthwaite, "That's it, you blokes are finished, you're going home." Kishenside had flown 148 missions in the Meteor since his arrival on the peninsula in March, sometimes as often as 4 missions a day. He was presented with a United States Air Medal for Valor and mentioned in dispatches by the Queen for his service. He arrived home in Sydney to his new wife, Beryl, who he had married just 6 weeks before the war, and to his new baby son, Gary, who was just a few days old. But for decades afterwards, when Jim Kishenside marched on Anzac Day, he had to endure the question from others, "What are those medals for, mate?" The hell of the Korean War had received limited and often censored coverage in the Australian media, despite the fact that more than 18,000 Australian personnel served in the conflict and 340 Australian lives were lost. It was the year 2000 before a National Korean War monument was unveiled in Canberra. While Jim Kishenside had been a student pilot back in the late 1940s, It had been noted on his service record that he showed a strong aptitude for leadership and instruction, and upon his return from Korea, he was the youngest of 4 pilots selected for the #1 jet instructors course. They were an elite quartet who would lead the transition of Australian military pilots into the jet age. In less than 4 years, he had risen from trainee pilot now to commissioned officer, instrument rating examiner, and fighter combat instructor. On the strength of his leadership abilities, he spent a period as interim CO of No. 21 Squadron at Laverton, and from there, a further opportunity for command was offered to him, but there was a catch. The posting was to the coldest and most isolated outpost on Earth. The RAAF have supported Australian research and exploration in Antarctica since Douglas Mawson's expeditions of 1929, when 2 defence pilots took charge of a gypsy moth, which was used for aerial surveying. However, the year 1960 was to be the most ambitious year yet for Antarctic aviation operation. Operations in the air had previously been limited to winter months only, when the sea ice at the coastal Australian base of Mawson was strong enough to support the landing of light aircraft. However, in 1960, Australian expeditioners would have the services of both the reliable DHC-2 de Havilland Beaver, which had been used in the Antarctic for years previous, and the additional services of a Douglas C-47 Dakota, a much larger aircraft which would extend the range of Australian Antarctic operations. Likewise, the goal was to construct an ice runway on a plateau above Mawson to allow both aircraft to fly all year round. And Jim Kishenside was selected to lead the largest ever contingent of RAF personnel sent to the frozen continent. So you can see the 12 of them pictured here, which was almost double the typical RAF contingent sent to Antarctica. The 12 landed at Mawson Station by icebreaker in February of 1960, and they had barely disembarked before their challenges began. So you can see here that the C-47 had travelled down to Mawson on the deck of the icebreaker, and even with its wings removed, it was such a tight fit that the nose cone was damaged when attempts were made to lift it overboard onto a pontoon by a crane to embark it to shore. Then they found that while there was a hangar at Mawson Base, it had been constructed in the days when light aircraft were in sole use. The C-47 was simply too big to fit inside. As a result, it had to be reassembled out on the open ice, with temperatures as low as -40 degrees. The result was that the air compressors that they would normally use to refit the 300 bolts which attached the wings to the main fuselage, all those air compressors froze, resulting in many of the small bolts having to be refitted with bare hands. The third catastrophe came when the aircraft was being towed by bulldozers to its resting place a mile west of the main base, when it escaped its tow lines, slithered down a snowbank, and damaged the tail section. The challenges further continued when, in order to keep the aircraft safe in the exposed outdoors, they had to dig 6-foot deep pits by hand to sink railway sleepers to anchor the aircraft to avoid it being blown away in an Antarctic blizzard. It took 5 months of agonizing outdoor labor, risking snow blindness, frostbite, and hypothermia to get the C-47 airborne. The brakes froze, hydraulic lines burst, moisture froze in the lines, gauges failed, and the undercarriage refused to retract in the freezing conditions. It was the 9th of July before the aircraft lifted off the ice for the first time. In the meantime, the workload of search and rescue, aerial survey, and transit between the 3 Australian bases had been carried solely by the trusty little DHC-2 Beaver. So in addition to their duties assisting Australian scientific expeditioners at Mawson, the RAF team had also identified the site for the revolutionary Blue Ice Runway, 16 kilometres inland from the Mawson base on an ice plateau in the Masson Ranges. The RAF team nicknamed the site Rumdoodle after a comedy novel they had found in the base library at Mawson. Because the area was away from the coast, the ice on the plateau would not melt in the same way as sea ice they had been flying off over the winter, allowing the Australian expeditioners to keep flying and surveying over the summer for the very first time. But Jim Kishonside was extremely nervous about the scheme. The plateau was incredibly exposed to the katabatic wind, which is a notorious weather system that roars out of the interior of the continent. Kishonside himself had almost been flung out of the sky in the Beaver, flying over coastal mountains by a sudden burst of this katabatic weather. Leaving his aircraft exposed on a plateau, even with the construction of a wind fence, and having to take off and land in the area would test the RAF's skills to the very limit. While both aircraft had made a number of flights individually from the Rumdoodle site, it was the 8th of December before both of them were brought to the same site simultaneously. But that night, the katabatic came. The super blizzard that hit the runway at Rumdoodle lasted for more than 40 hours. The camp was torn apart by winds in excess of 300 kilometres an hour, which is equivalent to a force 4 hurricane. The caravans, which were sheltering the men, were shifting up to 4 feet against their steel guy ropes. Both aircraft were torn from the extra deep moorings they'd been dug into, and the Beaver was physically torn apart. It took 2 days to find the C-47. The 7-ton aircraft had been blown almost 20 kilometres away and impaled against an ice cliff. It would never fly again. The fact the entire RAF squadron of 12 survived with only relatively minor injuries was little short of a miracle. The catastrophic loss of both aircraft brought the end of the RAAF's final full year of service in Antarctica. Kishonside called for a moratorium on plateau-based operations at Mawson, a call that was backed by the RAAF. And in 1963, the RAAF's Antarctic flight was disbanded. Kishonside did propose an alternative for safer aviation on the continent, to shift operations away from Mawson further south to the Australian base at Davis. Davis is relatively protected from katabatic winds and also has an abundance of exposed rock, which could be used to build a permanent rock runway, thereby reducing the effects of both whiteout and melting ice. But it was 2016, 66 years after this recommendation was made, that the Commonwealth Government announced construction of a runway at Davis, ironically, on the exact site that Kishonside had proposed. So I've taken you through 2 of the primary events that shaped Jim Kishonside's life and career with the RAAF. In the book, you'll find more. Jim's return to fighter combat in the 1960s conflict in Malaya, his command of No. 38 Transport Squadron, and preparation of pilots to fly in the jungles of Vietnam. But I'd just like to leave you by closing the circle, if such a thing is possible, with a return visit to Korea that Jim made in 2010 for the 60th anniversary commemorations of the outbreak of the war. He was now 80 years of age and had battled through 3 heart attacks and prostate and bowel cancer. He had considered returning to Korea in the past through the official Korea Revisit program, but after his struggles with his health, he felt that 2010 was now or never. The fact remains that the war in Korea has never officially ended. The armistice signed in 1953 brought victory for neither side and would do nothing to bring back the estimated 5 million people killed in the conflict. But the struggle between opposing political ideologies on the peninsula remains, with only a tenuous border on the 38th parallel keeping the two sides apart. The group of veterans who returned to Korea in 2010 were treated with reverence and respect by the still grateful South Korean people. Jim and his colleagues were appointed ambassadors for peace by the South Korean president himself. But for Jim, despite all the pomp and ceremony, this was also a chance for a quiet communion, to visit the Australian Memorial and look again across the hills to the place where so many of his friends lay in unmarked graves. It was a chance, perhaps, for a final goodbye in the place where innocence and mates had been lost forever. For Jim Kishenside, the 2010 revisit brought closure to some of the challenges that had confronted him 5 decades before. But he still asked the question, why him? Why not me? It seems that through all of those moments when his luck might have run out, whether it be flameouts, turbulence, bullets that never quite pierced the controls, a screaming blizzard that carried away a 7-ton aircraft but left his flimsy tin can of a caravan untouched. It seemed that luck or fate or destiny seems to have always been on his side. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Rochelle, for a very interesting presentation. I know very little about the Korean War. I sort of focus on World War II, so I was interested to hear Jim's story there. You certainly raised some interesting statistics. I was a bit amazed that he only had 8 hours training in a Meteor for conversion.
Yeah, terrifying.
Yeah. And initially he did 50 missions in 6 weeks, which was quite an achievement. That's a bit over a mission a day as an average. And in the end, he completed a total of 148 missions, sometimes up to 4 missions a day. So he was a very busy lad. So thank you for that.
It was very difficult to get replacement pilots to Korea at the time. So they really had no choice. They were initially, the terms of their deployment were for 6 months or 100 missions, which was similar to what the US pilots were being sent under.
Yep.
But because there were no replacement pilots coming, they simply just had to stay.
Yep.
So that's why that happened.
So Rochelle, you're happy to take some questions?
Yes, of course.
Righto. Maybe if you stop your share, that might help with the bandwidth issue.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Yep.
Okay, any questions, folks?
I'd just like to make a statement about one of Jim's episodes in the Antarctic, which is normally not well known. He and 2 of his pilots went to visit a emperor penguin rookery, and while Jim was standing there, one of the very largest penguins walked up to him, dropped a stone at his feet, which of course was a proposal. Jim didn't know whether to accept it or to run.
Yes, that's true.
Oh, very good. Rochelle, I've got a couple of questions. Do you happen to know, you mentioned the Korean Kid and the excuse me, the Meteor that was tagged with Korean Kid. Do you happen to know the serial number at all? Did Jim ever mention what the serial number of that Meteor was?
319.
319, was it?
Oh, 316.
139?
No, 316.
316.
316. That's correct. And ironically,
and who was shot
the aircraft that Jim flew his 100th mission in is now in the Australian War Memorial. It's called Rosemary.
Oh, right.
And it was on display for many years. I'm not sure if it's still there. They did have the nose of it on display. And yeah, that aircraft was the one in which he did fly his 100th mission.
Right. And who was it who was shot down and killed and taken prisoner of war in the Korean Kid 316?
In order to counter some of the difficulties with getting replacement pilots through the RAAF, a number of RAF pilots from Britain
Yeah.
and South Africa were brought to join the RAAF 77 Squadron in Korea. And
Yep.
the gentleman who was shot down in the Korean Kid was a South African pilot called Olaf Berg.
Oh, really? Right.
That's right. So they were
So
scrambled in a hurry, and I believe that they all just jumped in the
Sorry.
closest. On the day that happened, I believe they were scrambled in a big hurry.
Hello, you there, Rochelle?
Yes, can you still hear me?
Yes, Michelle, we can hear you, and somebody else was interrupting.
That was Gordon trying to get in. He's lost it too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, sorry, I had problems with Rochelle. She was going all garbled again. No one else had that issue?
No, we could hear it loud and clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So go ahead again,
No.
Rochelle.
Oh, I was just
Can
going
anyone
to
hear
say
me?
that my understanding of the day that the Korean Kid was shot down was that they were scrambled in a hurry.
Anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We're trying to hear Rochelle.
Ah, good.
Mute yourself.
And they all just dived into the closest aircraft. And so as a result, Berg was in 316 and Jim took a
Right.
reserve aircraft. And so, yeah, but it was obviously very difficult for him to watch his own aircraft shot down, knowing that it potentially could have been him in the seat. So,
Yes. Oh, very interesting.
I can
This
probably
is
add
that-
Roger. I can't get my video back.
it's Fredo here. I was going to say there's probably a linkage here as well to Owen's Up, because that aircraft, the nose of the aircraft, it's still in the War Memorial just. They're going to be decanting it out now with their redevelopment. But Owen Zupp's father also flew the same aircraft. And so Owen regularly makes trips down there with his kids to show them the aircraft. And
Yeah.
I suppose the connection there, someone said they didn't know much about the Korean War and our involvement there. We've actually got Owen writing a book as well to come out middle of 23 for the
Oh,
70th
wonderful.
year anniversary of the cessation
Yeah.
on the RAF operations in the Korean War. So I'm sure, Rochelle, I think I've already put you in contact with Owen, I believe.
Yes, Owen and I have certainly communicated over the last 2 years. He's been very kind, and I'm really looking forward to seeing his writing come out. You know, he obviously has a very close personal connection to the war through his father, and I think his insights will definitely be unique.
I should also make comment, Rochelle, we were very proud in the Air Force to be able to let you use the RAF badge on the book. You
Yeah.
covered a story that we believed really warranted being told, not just the Korean War aspects, but all the rest of his life. And so, you know, particularly what he did in the Antarctic. So thank you very much for your keeping alive the memory of one of our own.
Yeah, no, I was very appreciative of you know, being given permission to have that included on the book. It means a lot to me, you know, that as a gesture of support, and it makes all the work that we poured into this book completely worth it to have that endorsement. So thank you.
Any other questions? Lloyd, you got
Yes.
one?
Not so much a question. I wanted to thank you very much for that coverage. There are so many memories you brought back for me, because we had a very parallel situation, even to our early life. I was 18 months younger than Jim, but I grew up in Balmain and we had the same sort of thing. And my father had been killed in the Air Force, and I wanted to fly, but my mother didn't want me to, because I
Yeah.
might go to Korea, which is what happened, not much
Yeah.
to her dismay. And some of the other things, like Don Pinkston, one of my classmates, I was on 8 course. He was
Yeah.
shot down in my aircraft and taken prisoner. So there was
Oh.
a similar parallel there too. That was right near the end though, and they treated him fairly well, because they were treating the prisoners more kindly to have some sort of effect on the Panmunjom armistice negotiations. Yes.
Yeah, well, prisoners of war were certainly a great stumbling point to the peace talks throughout the war.
Mm.
I did read somewhere that there were over 550 meetings undertaken trying to,
Yep.
you know, coordinate an armistice, and prisoners of war were certainly a major stumbling block of that. So I'm pleased to hear that, you know, treatment of the POWs was certainly moderated as conflict went along, because initially it was significant, bad.
I'm always amazed at how forgotten the war is. They call it the forgotten war. And it's often not even mentioned between World War II and Vietnam. And it's really amazed me, because South Korea now is one of the best countries in the world, and North Korea is obviously one of the worst. And it's such a shame that they can't be united in peace.
Well, I think also, given the fact that Korea remains an international flashpoint, and I suppose it was probably brought back to world attention during the Donald Trump presidency, given the to and fro that he had, with Kim Jong-un, that more attention wasn't refocused on the original Korean conflict by that.
No.
So, we're certainly doing our best through publications such as this and Owen Zupp's book to come to really pay homage to the 18,848 Australians who served in Korea. And, I really feel passionate, about having their stories told. So
we lost 37 pilots total in the 77 squadron, which for the size of the squadron is a considerable number.
And I should add, I believe we've still got 18 MIA or become unrecovered war casualties. So we're actually currently working with an Air Force to maintain an understanding of where they might be. So if the borders do ever open up and we get in there, we can go search for them. So we don't leave our dead behind like the Americans.
Be pretty difficult now after all this time.
Absolutely. I don't mean like the Americans leave their behind. We have the same approach as the Americans. So,
of course.
Look, Lloyd, I suppose I've got a question for you. And sorry, Rochelle, just a quick one. Have you ever been interviewed for your oral history?
Yes. I've also written a book. I've also written a book called Diary of a Pilot, which has a couple of Korean stories in it, but the most of the ones are in Vietnam, and which was my second war, and my civilian life. I flew for 52 years total, so I've got quite a lot of stories in there.
I also have a team that do oral history interviews around the country, and we're in conjunction with the War Memorial. So are you in Queensland, obviously?
No, Melbourne.
Melbourne. Okay, I could probably get someone to come and do an interview on you. So we might want to swap notes after this.
Sure.
I could even probably get Mr. Michael Veach to come and interview, or should I say Squadron Leader Michael Veach. So we're really keen to, we've realised there's been such a focus on the Bomber Command and the World War II stories. And as you said, we haven't taken enough, paid enough attention to our Korean War and our Vietnam War members. So we want to go out there and capture those. So I'd be really keen to have one of my team come and interview you.
Yes, I'd welcome that, certainly.
That's great. Sorry,
Thank you.
Rochelle.
that's fine. That's fine. I think what you're doing is marvelous, and we really need to get these stories recorded. They're extremely important part of our, military history. So I applaud you. Fabulous.
I'd probably ask if anyone out there does know people that would like to be interviewed who have stories from the Korean War or even the interwar years. We're really, really keen to get those stories recorded and to make them accessible to the public. So it's only through word of mouth that we can find a number of these vets. And my fear is that we're talking a war that wasn't that long after the end of World War II, and there are not a lot of World War II vets around. So I need to make sure that we don't commit a sin and not capture the stories of the Korean War veterans.
Yeah.
I'm 88 now, so hopefully I'll be around for a bit longer. Do you have a contact number or email for me?
What I'll do, I'll get Peter. Are you able to put me in contact, or perhaps at the end of this, Lloyd, if you stay online, we can just, you and I can swap notes.
Okay.
Or through Peter, he's got my contacts.
Any other questions for Rochelle?
But just on a more general Korean War thing, it was written up in the newspapers today that we were discussing POWs before, that over 50,000 South Koreans were never returned to the South. They have been treated as slaves in mines, and their children and the children of those children are still doing it.
Yep.
Wow.
Oh, that's shocking.
Terrible. Yep.
It's dreadful.
And if people escape from North Korea into China, the Chinese send them back and they get shot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a couple of quick questions, Rochelle, before you go. when did Jim actually leave the RAF? What year did he leave the RAF? And what rank was he? And also, is Jim still around?
No.
Okay, so let me just make sure I get this right. You'll just have to bear with me. I've
Sure.
been out leading a pack horse expedition all week this week. I'm just sort of getting my brain back into gear. So
Just while you're doing that, that's something that Fredo mentioned before about the MIAs from Korea. There's still hundreds of MIAs from the Second World War.
Yeah.
And in my book from 78 Squadron, I think there's still about 5 or 6 still MIAs from that one squadron,
yeah,
despite all the wonderful work that I've forgotten his name now, the squadron leader after the Second World War did.
There's 3,100 and something MIAs from World War II. So it's a huge number.
Rundle.
Is it?
Rundle.
Yeah,
Rundle
squadron
did
leader
a lot of
Rundle, thank you.
research, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a very, unlike the United States military, I think it's in Hawaii, they've got a couple of hundred in their MIA team. We've got 3.
Yeah.
That'd be right.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's the best, but we do, as usual, punch above our weight.
Good.
so
Gordon.
Gordon, to answer your
Yes.
question, Jim's flying career ended at the end of 1969 with 38 Squadron, Transport Squadron. He was
Transport, yep.
flying Caribous. And he is very much still alive. He's now 90 years of age
Yes.
and in reasonably good health. So yes, he's still with
Okay.
us. So
Good. Despite his health problems, he's still with us, eh?
still with us, yes.
So did he go to Vietnam with 38 Squadron?
No. So his role was based in Australia and in Papua New Guinea. So as the CEO of 38 Squadron, his role was to prepare and oversee the training of pilots to fly in mountainous, tropical, jungle type conditions to fly Caribous. And so as a result, the transition for Australian pilots going from Richmond to Vietnam is that they undertook a training course in Papua New Guinea, which, as you can imagine, is extremely challenging flying conditions with steep mountains, high valleys, very changeable weather conditions, and so on. And so Jim oversaw that transition training before transport pilots were then sent to Vietnam. But no, he never went himself.
Right. Very good. Thank
And-
you very much. Excellent presentation.
And one other
too.
question was, what rank was he when he retired?
A wing commander.
Thank you.
Okay, any last question before we?
Comment. Rochelle, that was a brilliant presentation, and the professional of us has set a standard that I think we'll have to work hard to catch up with it, apart from the content, which was marvellous. But I thought you got the timing right, and the register was just right, and I was extremely impressed. So thank you very much on that regard.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Ditto.
Okay, many thanks again, Rochelle, for your
Yeah.
very interesting presentation.